Edward Snowden, a Russian spy?
If he had been a spy, the unexplained things would be explained.
Nicholas Lemann will be here to talk about Edward Jay Epstein's controversial new book about Snowden, How America Lost Its Secrets.
But he never can actually prove something.
Is civility a lost cause?
I didn't at all think that it was going to be a topic for the column because civility seemed like a fairly niche topic.
Our Backpage Ivory Tower columnist, James Ryerson, will join us to talk about 3 new books about the art and limits of civil discourse.
Before I knew it, I saw another book that had civility in the title and then kept looking and I found another book. That's how this particular column, for instance, took form.
Alexander Alter will give us an update from the literary world. Plus, we'll talk about what we and the wider world are reading. This is Inside the New York Times Book Review. I'm Pamela Paul. Nicholas Lemann joins us now. He is a professor of journalism at Columbia University and former dean of the School of Journalism there, a staff writer for The New Yorker. And this week he reviews on our cover a new book by Edward Jay Epstein called How America Lost Its Secrets, Edward Snowden, the Man and the Theft. Nick, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
I think before we talk about any book about Snowden, it's very helpful to know where the author is coming from. So who is Edward Jay Epstein?
Well, he's an interesting character. He's a veteran nonfiction writer. Long ago, he started to have an academic career, but he abandoned that decades ago. And he writes about the world of espionage a lot, among other things.
What other books has he written before this?
He's written a lot of books. The first book he wrote was called Inquest, which was one of the first books questioning the findings of the Warren Commission that investigated JFK's assassination. Over the years, he's written frequently about the Kennedy assassination. I guess the single most well-known thing that ever happened to him is, this is a very complicated, murky world, but there's this one character who was supposed to have a lot of information, and he summoned Epstein to his home in Florida to tell all over several days, and then they had a one-day interview, and then at the end of that day, the man was found dead. He also has written a book saying diamonds are worthless. He's also written a book about the economics of the movie business. He's also written a book questioning the self-congratulatory myths of the journalism business. He's written a lot of books.
Given the subject, where is he on the political spectrum?
I would generally say he's a conservative. Mm-hmm. He publishes more often in conservative journals than liberal journals. He has for many years. I would say he's more on the right than on the left. And
Snowden, of course, is one of those subjects or people that your opinion on him doesn't necessarily fall along typical political fault lines either.
Somewhat, although he's definitely has more fans on the left than on the right. But he would have some fans on the sort of libertarian right. Mm-hmm. Epstein gives the appearance of being very well connected in the professional intelligence community in the U.S. and to some extent elsewhere. Those folks really don't like Snowden. Mm-hmm. And the folks who don't like a permanent intelligence bureaucracy tend to like Snowden. So like Rand Paul and Ron Paul, his father, are generally pro-Snowden conservative libertarians.
Right. Well, let's talk about Epstein's view on Snowden. What does he set out to do in this book?
The book is complicated in this way. It's intelligence reporting, so you're dealing with a lot of suppositions, a lot of confidential sources, not a lot of things proven in the traditional sense. But clearly his sort of hypothesis that he spends a whole book exploring is that Snowden was a Soviet spy, or Russian spy, rather, and possibly also a Chinese spy.
Or possibly a Sino-Russian spy.
Yes, right. That's what he plays with throughout the book, is variations on the theme of Snowden being a spy. He sort of swims in and out of a statement where he says, okay, I have proven Snowden was a spy. And the sort of experience of reading the book is he'll sort of say, okay, let's take this moment, and here are the unexplained things in the narrative, And if he had been a spy, the unexplained things would be explained. But he never can actually prove something. But he has a whole kind of alternate view of Snowden from the one that you would have seen in the Oliver Stone movie about him, or the Laura Poitras documentary, Citizen 4.
Epstein recently wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal tied to the release of this book, but he wrote an earlier piece, right, that this kind of grew out of.
Right. So the first piece, which was, in the wake of the Snowden revelations back in 2013, I think the piece was published in 2014, was where he first said pretty baldly, I think Snowden was a spy, not a whistleblower. That clearly led to this book. He says that in the book and then immediately qualifies it. So again, I want to stress he doesn't have this really nailed, and the way to enjoy the book would be to say it's like reading a John le Carré novel. In fact, he often refers in the book to John le Carré novels. It's a sort of series of what might have happened, what might have been, etc. It's not sort of conventional journalism where you have everything nailed down.
What kind of case does Epstein make?
He makes the argument pretty much by picking apart, let's say, the Laura Poitras version, saying point after point of things that in that version don't quite fit, at least to his mind. And those would be, number one, how did Snowden, as a relatively lowly contractor working at the NSA, get all the stuff he got? He must have had help. The way he'd put it is, it seems implausible he didn't have help. That kind of language appears a lot in the book. Then, why did he fly to Hong Kong? Why did he spend 2 weeks in Hong Kong?
That's the Chinese component of the spy narrative.
Right. Why did he choose Hong Kong as the place to go? Why did he spend 2 weeks there before he publicly surfaced? Why did he make contact with Poitras and Glenn Greenwald, another journalist, months before he revealed all this stuff and before the best known of the many, many documents he pilfered was even written? What happened to the 900,000 or so documents that he didn't give to journalists, et cetera? There's a bunch
when you
of these
raise
questions.
these questions, it all sounds kind of, murky and possibly damning. I mean, what is the Poitras Greenwald explanation for why he flew to Hong Kong and why he met with them so far in advance of the revelations?
I think their explanation would be, and as a book reviewer, I didn't go ask them to answer the charges in the book, would be this person is a sincere whistleblower who was seeing things at the NSA that horrified him, so he made contact with us, and then it was quite a complicated matter. Greenwald was living in Brazil at the time, to sort of find a place in the world where, in the morass of passport and visa problems, we could all physically get together and exchange information. And there was a lot of sort of spy novel things about false identities and tests to prove and so on. So the heart of their version was he was a courageous whistleblower who came across all these things that shocked him and then very ingeniously found a way to sort of slip through the net and pass this information to them. At the end of the book, his sort of bottom line is maybe Snowden was a whistleblower, but as the story ends, he ends up being a person who Epstein believes put lots of national security information into the hands of the Russians, possibly also the Chinese. So, in a sense, what his intention was isn't what really matters. What the effect was is what matters.
One of the more interesting accusations, I guess, that he makes Epstein in the book is that Snowden had nearly 1 million documents that he did not release to journalists.
So remember that the Snowden incident was a huge shock to the American intelligence and foreign policy establishments. And you have a near total divergence in perspective on this between the kind of people who are hostile to that world on both the right and predominantly the left, and people inside that world. So the data that Epstein has on how many documents there were and how many pertain to violations of the law by the NSA, the stuff that the Guardian won a Pulitzer Prize for publishing, tend to come from folks inside or allied with the U.S. intelligence and foreign policy bureaucracies, including, think tanks and other analysts, as well as his own sources. Members of Congress are almost completely anti-Snowden, too. So that material is out there for anybody who wants to look for it on the web. It's not a sort of unique thing that Epstein has. It's just another part of the conversation that the large part of the world that was instantly anti-Snowden, and if not regarding him as a spy, regarding what he did as a major security breach that was harmful to U.S. interests, that group has a lot of material out there that you can find.
As the former dean of the journalism school at Columbia and a longtime journalist, you obviously see the implications that Snowden has for journalism. What are the implications for these kind of revelations? What is the proper role of journalists in publicizing them, I guess, or bringing them to readers' attention?
Journalists or news organizations don't have the kind of monopoly that they used to have on transmission of information to the public. It used to be that there'd be a whistleblower, leaker, et cetera, usually had physical documents that bring them, as Daniel Ellsberg did, in suitcases to a journalist, and then the journalists or team of journalists would decide, very responsibly what to publish, what not to publish, and would publish them. So now, first of all, because of the digital revolution, the whistleblower has access to enormous amounts of material that is very easy to transport around the world. Essentially, you're in an age where journalists are not necessary because the whistleblower population, or whatever they are, is able to self-publish.
Right.
So in a sense, the power relationship has been a little reversed. Folks like Julian Assange and Snowden, as critical as they generally are of the so-called mainstream media, they feel the need to form partnerships with people they trust in the media. So you have a world where The Guardian and the Washington Post have part of this story, but also activists who, when I was young, these organizations wouldn't have had anything to do with, like Glenn Greenwald and Laura Poitras, also have a piece of the story in partnership. The day could come when the whistleblowers say, we just don't need journalists anymore.
Right.
Or they could keep saying journalists are useful to us. And, in the same vein, journalists have a lot of tough choices to make about when they publish purloined material. Are they being heroes, as we like to think we are, or not? And a good example there is all the John Podesta emails that came out during the campaign,
right,
which are clearly, pertain to matters of public importance. They're also clearly stolen. I myself, I'm not tooting my own horn, but I was asked by the New Yorker to write about them, and I wouldn't do it because I just didn't think, you should sort of play along with that kind of theft of information.
Right.
But
then there's a very competitive media landscape.
Yeah, it's competitive. It's hard to ignore. It's the argument is it's out there anyway for anybody who wants to look for it. So why shouldn't we as journalists put it into context and try to, explain it to people rather than just having these raw data dumps and tendentious uses of information out there. So it's a super complicated picture these days, and I think it'll only get more so. And add to that all of the enormous changes and challenges in the journalism landscape, and who knows where this is all going to go.
All right. A whole lot of murky fun, I guess, or not fun. Nick, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Nick Lemann is a professor of journalism at Columbia, former dean of the journalism school, a staff writer at The New Yorker, and this week he reviews on our cover Edward Jay Epstein's new book, How America Lost Its Secrets, Edward Snowden, the Man and the Theft.
This is John Williams. I'm joined by Alexandra Alter, who has news from the publishing world this week. Hi, Alexandra.
Hi, John.
So you had a story up online earlier this week and in the paper about politics and publishing.
Politics and publishing, yes. It's an interesting moment, particularly for publishers that run their own conservative imprints, which is basically all of the major publishers.
Yeah.
They're coming into a Republican administration, President Trump, and a Republican-led Congress, and that has typically meant that they will have fewer sales. Sales have been great for conservatives under 8 years of Barack Obama. It was a booming time under Clinton. And on top of that, I think they're facing a lot of challenges with how to kind of address these major political shifts and the kind of fragmentation of the ideology on the right. Mm-hmm. You have new political movements that Donald Trump has kind of energized, including what is often referred to as the alt-right. And as publishers try to kind of appeal to that constituency or not, they're facing really uncomfortable questions. So
and the one sort of lightning rod for this, even though your piece is very wide-ranging and talks about, and we'll get into that too, the one new book that was recently signed up by someone named Milo Yiannopoulos, who I don't know if all listeners know who that is, but what's that story?
This author, Milo Yiannopoulos, signed a deal with Simon & Schuster's Threshold Editions, which is their conservative imprint. He's a tech editor at Breitbart News, which is a pretty extreme right-wing website, and he is kind of infamous on the internet. He was thrown off Twitter last year and just kind of delights in provoking people, liberals especially. He goes around the country speaking on college campuses, speaking out against political correctness, mocks feminists, transgender people. He's just sort of throws these lightning bolts. And so when Simon & Schuster made a publishing deal with him, a lot of people in the literary world were incredibly uncomfortable with it. You have independent stores saying they won't carry the book, or possibly even they'll carry fewer books by Simon & Schuster overall. You have Simon & Schuster's own authors speaking out against it, various calls for boycotts, and just recently there was a letter that a bunch of Simon & Schuster's children's authors sent to the CEO of the company, basically protesting this and saying they felt like this was giving a platform to hate speech, racism, misogyny. And they said this is not an issue of free speech, what some people have cast it as. He has plenty of outlets. This is a major company kind of giving a mainstream stamp of approval to these kinds of views.
What has Simon & Schuster's reaction been like?
They've put out various statements. I couldn't get anyone on the record to talk to me to offer a formal response, or even to talk about the process of acquiring this book and maybe what some of the deliberations were like, because I'm sure there was a debate. But no one would speak to me. The formal statement that they put out essentially said that they published a wide range of political views and they felt like he had an interesting perspective and that they would never condone hate speech of any kind. So I was curious how much of his other writing they've actually read, or if this
whether they're
this
expecting the book
be
to be much different.
Substantially different. And it is interesting, too. I mean, I spoke to a number of other conservative editors, like, for example, Margie Ross, who's the publisher of Regnery, which is a pretty not far right, but it's a very conservative imprint.
Is that an imprint within another house? Or
this is an independent publishing house, but certainly they've published, many of the books you've seen on the bestseller list attacking Hillary Clinton. I mean, their perspective is well known. And she considered this book, the Milo Yiannopoulos book, and felt like it would be too kind of controversial for their base.
Wow.
So this is where you see kind of the whole kind of conservative audience breaking down along ideological lines, which you didn't really see maybe under President Obama or back, when Bill Clinton was president. I mean, conservative writers and publishers have had a great run attacking Hillary Clinton and sort of being the ideologial underdogs and getting their ideas out. And now as their ideas are sort of going to become policy, I think they'll have a less easy target. So it was interesting to talk to some other editors at conservative houses who felt like this book might be too controversial for them.
Yeah, well, it's interesting to see also whether this will have an effect on other publishers going forward if they're going to want to attract the kind of attention Simon & Schuster has. I mean, I feel like the attention's probably okay for Milo because he might sell more books because of it, but the company
he's thrilled.
has to be kind of uncomfortable. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the book did shoot right to the top of Amazon as soon as somebody said the words boycott. So, he's perfectly happy with the publicity. But it's interesting. I mean, I think maybe publishers will be hesitant next time.
Yeah, but it's interesting because they do most of them do have these conservative imprints. And so now that liberals are sort of the opposition or set to be, they probably have to prepare for a bit more aggressive criticism of certain signings.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. I think, many of the people I spoke to for this story, many of the editors and publishers are being very circumspect, too, about what they're signing up because they realize that, the audience that they've been relying on for the past 8 years is maybe not going to be needing to see their viewpoints validated in a book if they have those viewpoints validated by the president or by the Congress. And moreover, a lot of the editors and publishers I spoke to are just like everyone in the country, sort of unsure what the next administration will look like. If President-elect Trump declines to follow through on some of his campaign promises, will you see conservative authors publishing books kind of attacking him for that? Will you see anyone from the Never Trump movement coming out and saying we need to rethink the future of the Republican Party? People aren't sure kind of what ideological points need to be made yet, and so they're waiting. And also it's just such a volatile moment when, you could have one policy that everyone on the right seems to be behind, and then with a tweet from the president-elect, suddenly everything shifts. So it's hard for publishers to react in real time to those kinds of volatile moments.
Yeah, really, really interesting days for everybody, including the book business. Thanks, Alexandra.
Thanks for having me.
James Ryerson joins us now to talk about books about civility. Jamie, thank you for being here.
Thanks, Pamela. Thanks for having me.
This is your first time on the podcast since you became our Ivory Tower columnist. Explain a little bit about what this column is and what you try to do in it.
Every 2 months, we run this column called Ivory Tower. What we try to do is find 3 or 4 or 5 recent university press books, usually on a related theme. I try to not only give a quick sense of what each book is about, but when possible, try to show how the books are in some kind of tension or conversation or amplify each other.
So for listeners who are not familiar with the idea of university presses, what is it that makes a university press different from other publishing houses?
Well, a university press is typically affiliated with the university whose name is in the press title. They publish, broadly speaking, 2 different kinds of books. Some of them are books that are very much intended for other academics or students, undergraduate, graduate students, but they also tend to have divisions or editors who emphasize books that might well have been trade press books, a book you might have seen in Basic Books or Farrar Straus or something, typically written by academics, but often looking to connect with a wider readership.
Yeah, it's interesting. Among academics, there's a sort of hierarchy of what they try to do. There's the academic books that they have to publish, right, as part of their job. And then there is the next sort of tier from that, which is the trade division of an academic press, where they try to reach a wider audience. And then in certain ways, not particularly for their job necessarily, but for their larger careers, there's the having a book out from Random House, say, or FSG that, reaches a very broad audience and makes them a star.
That's right. And I think my sense, mostly impressionistic, is that 10 or 20 years ago, a lot of trade presses would publish a certain kind of book that you might think of as intellectual or academic, and that as they've stopped publishing as many of those, the university presses have kind of taken that as an opportunity to do more books that reach a wider audience, sell a little better.
So when you do these columns, you tend to work thematically. And I know because I've seen the shelves that you go through that there are a huge number of academic books published in a given year. How do you go through them and figure out, like, okay, this is what I want to write about?
The process so far, I think I've done 8 columns now, is when I started, I didn't really know how the process would go, never having tried to do this before. But I find that it tends to be pretty organic. As I go through, I'll notice just, a title here, a title there that catches my attention. And as I spend more time going through the shelves and then start to go through some catalogs, I will usually start to detect a theme. In this case, there was one book in particular that I had seen, and I didn't at all think that it was going to be a topic for the column because civility seemed like a fairly niche topic. And before I knew it, I saw another book that had civility in the title, and then I kept looking, and I found another book that didn't have civility in the title, but turned out to be on tolerance, which is a very related issue. So, that's how this particular column, for instance, took form.
Let's go through the 3 books quickly, the titles. The first is Tolerance Among the Virtues by John R. Bolin, and this is published by Princeton University Press, one of the larger university presses. The second is Mere Civility, Disagreements and the Limits of Toleration by Teresa Bejan, and that is from Harvard University Press. And then How Civility Works by Keith J. Bybee, which is from an imprint of Stanford University Press called Stanford Briefs. So How Civility Works, what is this book about? What is Bybee's argument, if there is one, in this book?
Bybee's interested in a number of things, but I would say that the principal thing he's interested in is what you might call the elusiveness of the idea of civility. In the abstract, civility seems like something that we all obviously want, but in practice it gets a little bit trickier. So, for instance, we all want to learn how to disagree with each other without being disagreeable. We all feel like there should be some minimal threshold for public life so that, if you fall below that in the way you treat people, you're not really considered part of the group, but as long as you kind of maintain a certain basic level of decency in the way you interact with other people, that we're all sort of together in this, even when we disagree on a lot of issues. So that's very, in the abstract, very appealing. But the problem is that, when you ask people, what is disagreeable behavior, or what is that minimal threshold, becomes much more controversial. In addition, when you try to pursue civility, it often looks like you're kind of prosecuting dissent because you're saying, well, your behavior, your views are beyond the pale. That's uncivil. So, for instance, if you're in power and there's people who are protesting you, and you can say, well, hey, look, your views are uncivil, and it's a way of possibly quelching dissent. So there's concerns start to seep in once you start to try to figure out exactly what disagreeable means, exactly what it means to maintain a certain basic level of respect for other people.
So you can actually disagree about this.
Well, that's
hopefully in a civil way.
That's exactly what Bybee sort of comes to, is that unfortunately it's a bit of a paradox, because the whole point of civility, you might think, is that even if we disagree on all kinds of specific issues, we at least agree on the kind of rules of debate. We at least agree on what counts as manners. Mm-hmm. The paradox for Bybee is that sort of suggests that somehow we can kind of escape our kind of clashing sets of values and somehow miraculously agree on the ground rules. And the problem is that the ground rules are just as much a subject of debate as anything else. So that paradox is what interests Bybee. And his solution is really just to embrace it and to say we have to kind of accept that civility and the struggles for civility is going to be just as messy as the kind of debates which we're kind of hoping civility will help us manage. So it's that paradox that drives his book.
Which I guess naturally brings us to the next topic, which or the next 2 books, which is probably why you chose them, which is that I imagine part of this is about tolerating disagreement.
Yeah. So the second book I discussed, the Bejan book called Mere Civility, is really focused on the sort of origins of these kind of ideas of civility we might have today, the kind of intellectual origins. And she goes back to the 17th century when there was a huge number of sort of religious views afoot that were all clashing with each other. And you had a number of thinkers, people like John Locke or Thomas Hobbes or Roger Williams, who were trying to figure out how a kind of tolerant society, how an inclusive society could deal with all these people who kind of hated each other or mm-hmm. thought that people's views were completely anathema. So she's interested in the 3 different strategies that each of these thinkers represents and the legacy of those strategies today. So, for instance, Hobbes was very concerned that if the disagreement would get so strident that it would threaten the diversity of views in society. So his solution was basically to say, look, in a tolerant society, we can have as much diversity of view as possible. You can basically think whatever you want. Just don't openly disagree with anybody. He called that kind of civil silence. It's basically like mind your own business, bite your tongue. You can think whatever you want, just don't say it. That was Hobbes's notion of kind of civility that would allow a society to be tolerant and inclusive.
I should say at this point that you're an editor. Your day job is as an editor on the op-ed page here at the Times. So if you followed Hobbes's advice, that would sort of not be very good in terms of your line of work.
Precisely. We might have to gravitate towards John Locke's view, which is, okay, we have an inclusive, tolerant society. We want to have a lively debate. But Locke's view is that certain views might be so disrespectful that we wouldn't be able to kind of sustain a tolerant society. So his solution was, we're going to allow for debate, we're going to allow for conflict, but we're going to suggest that there shouldn't be as diverse a range of views as possible, that if you can't manage to have a view that respects the views of your opponents, that you're kind of beyond the pale. You're engaging in uncivil behavior if you can't kind of muster basic respect for your opponent. Bejan's concern with both of these views, although you can kind of see both of them today. One is mind your own business, bite your tongue. That's one way of being civil. The other is you can argue as much as you want, but only if you can see your opponent is worthy of some level of respect. Bejan's concern is that these are conceptions of a tolerant society that are rooted in either suppression or exclusion. So she gravitates towards the third view, which is that of Roger Williams, who advocated
of Rhode Island,
who the colonial founder of Rhode Island, who advocated what he called mere civility. And his notion was that a tolerant society could be based on a much thinner foundation than people today might think. The basic idea was you can say whatever you want, you can find views as abhorrent and unworthy of respect as possible, but you have to let them hang around and you have to argue with them, and you can't shut down the debate. And that was more of the Williams approach, which was rooted in the actual hard work of building a diverse community, which is what impresses Bejan. So that is the conception of mere civility in her book.
And John Bolin, Tolerance Among the Virtues. What does he address in this book?
Where Bybee's interested in civility as sort of an object of political struggle, and Bejan's interested in civility as a kind of modus vivendi that will help us deal with disagreement and difference in a modern society, Bolin is interested in tolerance in the sense of what you might think of as just a moral virtue.
Should you be tolerant of intolerant behavior? And does he go into that?
Bejan's very interested in those questions. Because Roger Williams was a proponent of a man who created a tolerant society, but who himself really found all the views that he allowed into his colony abhorrent. But his view of civility was we all have to kind of hate each other, but we all have to be kind of free to openly argue and hear each other. But again, that's sort of the notion of civility or of tolerance as a kind of way of getting along, a modus vivendi. For Bolin, he's interested in tolerance as a kind of timeless moral virtue, and he's very much working in the tradition of medieval theologian Thomas Aquinas, who gave accounts of all kinds of classical virtues, courage, temperance, and but never gave an explicit account of tolerance, and that's what Bolin is trying to do.
Which also gets a bad rap a lot of the time, right? It's sort of being like a moral relativist, like.
Yes, for Bolin, he thinks that a lot of people think of toleration as a kind of very modern way of kind of accepting all kinds of differences that maybe you should be objecting to on some moral ground. And so though Aquinas never gave an account of tolerance explicitly, Bolin thinks that he can, in that same tradition, give a similar account. And one of the main moves that he makes is that he sees tolerance as a very similar virtue to a kind of Christian notion of love's endurance or forbearance. It tries to get some purchase on tolerance by comparing it and contrasting it with this theological conception. Bolin is both a philosopher but also a seminary professor, so he's coming from that tradition.
Your role at the op-ed page is to facilitate this kind of discourse in print. Was there anything that you read in these three books that especially sort of struck you as relevant to that?
I feel in terms of the work I do here at the Times at the op-ed page, Bybee's insistence that civility is not going to be something that we all sort of instantly agree on, but that it's going to be something that is achieved or not achieved according to different conceptions of civility through some kind of political struggle, seemed relevant. We know at the op-ed page we're not involved in a political struggle, but we have a certain conception of what we think is the kind of bounds of respectable debate by simply getting out pieces that fall within that realm and not publishing pieces that we think fall outside that realm. In our own small way, we're participating in a kind of vision of civility as we see it, and that's contributing to the same kind of dynamic political environment that Bybee's talking about.
And probably more difficult to do that in the current environment than usual. Jamie, thank you so much.
Thanks, Pamela, for having me.
James Ryerson, again, is our Ivory Tower columnist. The 3 books that he reviews this month are on Civility, How Civility Works by Keith Bybee, Mere Civility by Teresa Bejan, and Tolerance Among the Virtues by John Bolin. Greg Coles and John Williams join us now to talk about what we and other people are reading. Hi, guys.
Hey, Pamela.
All right, Greg, let's start off with the other people. What are they reading on the bestseller list?
There's a new number 1 at the top of the hardcover fiction list. It's by Danielle Steele. Her new novel is The Mistress, new at number 1. And Stuart Woods has like the millionth entry in his Stone Barrington series called Below the Belt. That's new at number 3.
These are authors who were bestsellers and on the bookshelf
in the
back
1980s.
In the 80s when I worked at B. Dalton. Yes, they were. They already had written many books by
long
then.
Gone,
Yeah.
but Stuart Woods and Danielle Steele still chugging along.
All right, some more newish stuff in the nonfiction.
The scientists Elizabeth Blackburn and Alyssa Epple have a book out called The Telomere Effect. It's an anti-aging book. Telomeres are that's the name for the kind of hardened cap or tip at our chromosomes. They're made out of a protein called telomerase, which Elizabeth Blackburn discovered.
I already feel worried about this.
She won the Nobel Prize for this back in 2009 for discovering this component that telomeres are made out of.
What are we doing wrong with our telomeres?
Well, they protect our chromosomes from damage, and as we age or as we participate in unhealthy living, they start to get shorter, and allowing the chromosomes to fray, just as shoelaces would do if they didn't have the little aglets at the end.
Ooh, nice word.
Yeah, don't look at mine.
So Blackburn and Epple in this book talk about how through healthy living, through exercise, through eating right, through various things, we can delay the shortening of these telomeres and even potentially rebuild them. We can make them get longer again.
For those of us who don't, there's concealer. All right. What else?
Also new on the nonfiction hardcover list is a nonfiction book by Douglas Preston, who is best known for his Aloysius Pendergast thriller series that he writes with Lincoln Child. But this one's nonfiction. It's called The Lost City of the Monkey God. And it's a book about archaeology and anthropology, the search for a lost city in Honduras, in the rainforest there.
I went to the lunch for that book, and I haven't read it yet, but I know that there is something extremely exciting and surprising that happens midway through that I will not reveal, but that certainly makes me want to read it.
I also want to quickly point out that on the print and ebook combined fiction list this week, one of our best novels of the year, Ian McGuire's The Northwater, makes its debut on that list. What's interesting is it's on the combined list, but not on the hardcover list, which suggests that people are buying it as an ebook.
Perhaps they are.
Yeah.
All right. All because of us.
Yeah.
All right. John, what are you reading?
A couple of weeks ago, you asked me what kinds of things I like to read over the holidays, and I kind of bemoaned the fact that I don't have the time anymore over the holidays as an adult with a job to read things like Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain and long, sprawling classics like that. So I decided to pick up The Magic Mountain and just force my way through it. It's about 700 pages, and I'm about 100 pages into it and loving it. I know that you've read it in the past, and it's a favorite of yours. It was published in 1924. It's set in the Swiss Alps at this sanatorium, a tuberculosis sanatorium, where the young protagonist goes to visit his cousin who's recovering there, and he goes just to visit him, but he ends up, as the back of the book will tell you, staying for 7 years. So he's only been there a couple of weeks at the point I'm at. And it's full of great little riffs on all kinds of philosophical and historical moments. And it's also an allegory about, famously, an allegory about pre-World War I Europe and the bourgeois life there.
But it's one of those books that can sort of serve as a metaphor for any period of terrible times. So I'm sure you'll find like all kinds of implications
So you're saying it's relevant.
for our days, yes.
And it's funny because when I said that I don't have time, you sort of think back to when you were a kid and reading classics felt overwhelming, not just because of their length, but because they were quote unquote difficult. Mm-hmm. But as an adult, the great thing is that they're not difficult. They're just big. So, this is really just like reading I read two mediocre 400-page books all the time. So why not read one great
a 700-page book actually should take you, a day and a half?
I'm going to need
this half hour.
I'm hoping this doesn't turn into my Hamilton. I think this is going to be at least a couple of weeks, given other work reading.
Well, it's kind of like Tolstoy in that way. It's like, it's not hard. It's just long.
It's incredibly pleasurable, actually. Yeah, it's very, not easy, but it's fun. Greg, what are you reading?
Well, speaking of pleasurable and easy books, I've got a couple books that I'm working on right now. One is Robert Coover's new novel. Coover, of course, going back almost 50 years, is one of the great postmodernist kind of inventors. He really was at the forefront of the postmodern novel.
I think he's almost 90 now.
I think he is, yeah. And his new novel, which is not postmodern in any kind of experimental sense. There's nothing difficult or experimental or avant-garde about it, but is maybe postmodern in its pastiche sense. It's called Huck Out West, and it completely borrows Mark Twain's character Huck Finn, and Tom Sawyer is in there, and it just picks up the story of Huck Finn where the adventures of Huckleberry Finn ended, which is Huck lighting out for the territories, and it actually feels like a novel that Twain himself could have written. It's very funny, very adventurous, lively, where Huck Finn as a novel was obviously and supremely concerned with racism and slavery. This one is very concerned with America's treatment of the Native Americans. Huck Out West gets caught up with a stand-in for General Custer, and it's kind of about the wholesale slaughter of Indian tribes. And it's also just an adventure story and catching up with some of the characters that we met in Tom Sawyer and in Huck Finn. It's a lot of fun. It's very funny. Ribald, and the book that I was reading right before it was Paul Beatty's The Sellout, which is also very much a book about kind of America as a colonial power, America's treatment of its marginalized peoples. And so this is a really great follow-up to that book.
There's a UFO on the cover of the other book you have in front of you, so I guess that's a little less concerned with realistic issues.
It's mostly a very realistic book. There are some exceptions. It's a story collection called Homesick for Another World. The author is Otessa Moshfegh. I think I'm pronouncing that right. And you may remember that shortly before Christmas, I was reading her novel Eileen, which came out in 2015. This is only her second book. She's a very young writer, but she is so talented. She feels as if she's been at it forever. She's not just promising, but she is there. Yeah. She's one of the kind of most exciting young talents that I've read in recent years. There's a feel, both in Eileen and in many of these stories, of a kind of Mary Gates skill. She's got a very severe, uncompromising vision, but also a wildness at the same time. She's just very interested in exploring characters and characters' physicality, their physicality in their body, physicality in the world, and also their social standing. And so she's just tremendously impressive. I'm enjoying these stories a lot.
That's high praise. Pamela, high praise from you?
For a total shift in gears, I will first say what I'm reading, and then, what I finished reading was the James Lasden, The Fall Guy, and I highly recommend it. Wow, did I like that book. It was just a really fun book that, I don't know, it's like a male unreliable narrator, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of I'm not going to compare it to Gone Girl. It's a very different kind of book, but
it keeps you guessing.
We can say that our hero is not all that he seems to be, and he narrates it from the first person, and I loved that, getting into his mind and then sort of slowly realizing that perhaps this isn't the,
Do you see the Patricia Highsmith thing?
Yes,
Yeah.
totally. Yes. So the Ripley fans, take a look. But now for something very different, I actually consciously decided that I thought about it for the month of January, but I'm liking it so much I might carry it into February. I decided to read things that are not absorbing. I kind of wanted to read the books that I have lying around, often like self-help books, how-to books, impulse buys, coffee table books, the kind of books that you have around, you always intend to look at or read or just look at, and then you never do.
Yeah.
And you're like, wow, that looks like such a good book. There's a reason I grabbed that, but you never actually look at it. And generally with how-to and self-help, I sort of feel like just having it's the thing, and then I don't have to read it. Like I'll just miraculously absorb what's in it just by having picked it up. So I'm actually reading from cover to cover the book Spark Joy by Marie Kondo. I know.
You're Kondoizing.
I'm not. No, that's the thing. I'm not doing anything. I'm not following any of her advice. I'm just reading it, and I feel better already. It's also, part of what draws me to a book like this is first of all, it's phenomenon has sort of come and I passed. I think we're already into hygge or whatever that is. That's hygge. That's the new
just
thing,
as bogus,
which is
by the way.
right? Danish cozy thing. Is it Danish? Cozy?
It is. It's Danish cozy.
Danish
yeah.
cozy. Put on your wool socks and sit by a fire and knit rough fabric together.
Right. Now that there's nothing left in your house to do because of Kondoizing,
right?
just sit by the fire.
So I'm already well
socks.
out of the the wave, the current wave right now by going back to Kondo. But I find it really fascinating. A lot of the things that she advocates are things that I would never do. She very much likes to put things vertically, which I find fascinating. It's not enough
an example.
So utensils, various shirts should
Socks,
always be they always need to be vertical. I've only spent a few weeks of my life in Japan, but I think have you all been to Japan?
No.
It's such a particular place, and a lot of this book is very, very Japanese, and it interests me also to see how in this American edition of the book they changed certain things, but then they opted to keep other things totally Japanese, and just I guess they figure suck it up, Americans, deal with the references to chopsticks.
How does the verticality
thing?
Japanese? Is it because small spaces and so
it
it's easier to
probably
pack
is related to
more in
the small
vertically?
spaces,
It's a very New York thing too.
Yeah.
One of the things about Japan is that it's all about the packaging. It almost doesn't matter what's inside the box. So when you go to a Japanese department store, it's really a great joy. The wrapping of whatever it is you buy, it could be that you're buying a fork. It is so delicately and beautifully wrapped in such a spare and yet loving and careful way that you don't want to unwrap it. You're just I'll just keep it in the wrapping forever. So reading this book, you sort of start to feel lightly Japanese in a very good way, or at least I do. And the only thing that I've straightened as a consequence, and I'm nearly done with it, are my belts, which are now not vertical. They are lying in a line, but before they were in a crazy tangle. They looked like the snakes at the bottom of the snake pit in Raiders of the Lost Ark. And so I finally, inspired by this Marie Kondo book, went over to that snake pit of belts, that belt pit, and was you know what, you could gather the courage to line them up, which I did. And so I feel like I've done the KonMari method in my own way. And when I finish the book,
whenever I've talked to people about it, I've just realized that the one thing I can't do, the only thing I really have a lot of is books. And I am as strict as I can be about it, and I get rid of them sometimes, but there's no way that I could get rid of enough of them to please the system. So.
Well, and also here's the insidious thing. Here's another way in which I'm absolutely not Marie Kondo and never will be and do not aspire to be, which is that she insists that when you organize your book, no matter what, you never open up a book. Never ever start to read it, which is
while you're organizing.
You just pick it up, you feel the joy or the non-joy. Oh my God, it's a terrible, terrible system in my view. It's something I would, I can't even imagine how much money I'd have to be paid to do that sort of thing. And yet reading about it feels just fine.
Well, we'll check in with you in a couple of weeks. This might be a delayed take.
Right, maybe I'll have organized my cosmetics brushes.
Your
at
office
that
is going to look a lot different.
All right, Greg, John, thanks so much.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. Our producer is Jocelyn Gonzalez, and you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.